Welcome to another Detective Agatha Marple mystery, The Vanishing Heir, a Detective Tales. If you are new to our channel, please do consider subscribing to us and giving us a like. If you enjoy this thriller detective story, and if you are a regular, welcome back. The great halls of Whitcomb Manor had stood for centuries, their carved oak panels bearing silent witness to the whispers of generations. Tonight, however, those whispers had turned into something sharper, more urgent. Half-muttered speculations, hushed exchanges behind closed doors, the uneasy rustling of silk against polished mahogany floors. Sir Reginald Whitcomb was dead. In life he had been a man of unwavering conviction, a relic of the Empire's gilded past, a titan of industry, a peer of the realm, and if whispers were to be believed, a man with secrets. His sudden demise, occurring rather inconveniently before the reading of his will, had sent a tremor through both his family and the broader circles of high society. But it was not grief that lingered in the air of Whitcomb Manor. It was something else, something like fear. "Well, it is a dreadful business," muttered Eleanor Hartley, her gloved fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her champagne coupé. "But one mustn't let propriety lapse, even in grief." Across from her, Charles Whitcomb, the late Sir Reginald's younger brother, gave a sardonic chuckle. "You do the family credit, Eleanor, maintaining composure even as the vultures gather." Eleanor smiled, but it was the sort of smile one used at society luncheons, polite, polished, entirely devoid of mirth. "One must always maintain composure, Charles. Isn't that what you always say?" The drawing-room of Whitcomb Manor was a cavernous space, its high ceilings adorned with dark beams, its enormous fireplace now hosting a waning fire that crackled with a kind of reluctant warmth. The family had assembled here, some standing in uneasy clusters, others seated as if the act of claiming a chair afforded them some small measure of control. Among them was Agatha Marple, a silver-haired woman of unassuming stature, seated by the window, knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. She had been hired, discreetly, by Eleanor Hartley, a woman of modern convictions and hidden anxieties, to look into certain peculiarities regarding the family finances. At present, however, Agatha was merely observing. The clinking of glass, the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of hollow laughter, it all ceased the moment Edmund Whitcomb entered the room. Tall, lean, with a hint of wildness about him, Edmund carried himself with the kind of defiant ease that both fascinated and scandalized the old guard. He was the heir to the Whitcomb fortune, but more to the point, he was a man who had made himself deeply inconvenient to those who had a vested interest in tradition. "Ah, the prodigal grandson," Charles murmured as he sipped his drink. "Uncle," Edmund acknowledged, though without warmth. His gaze swept across the room before settling on Eleanor. Something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a flicker of something unsaid. But before the moment could solidify, the butler entered. "The solicitor has arrived, sir. The will was to be read in the morning, for tonight the guests and family members would remain within the manor. But when morning came, Edmund Whitcomb was nowhere to be found. A mystery begins." Agatha Marple was up early. It was a habit ingrained in her long before she had become a detective, long before she had begun peering into the dark corners of people's lives and finding the dust they had hoped would remain undisturbed. And so, when the household awoke to a flurry of servants' whispers and the sharp-edged concern of the family, she was already seated in the breakfast-room, calmly spreading marmalade on her toast. "Miss Marple?" Eleanor appeared at the doorway, her expression carefully measured. "Something's happened." "Indeed?" Agatha took a deliberate sip of her tea. "It's Edmund. He's missing." Agatha Marple did not believe in coincidences. A patriarch dies, and the heir vanishes before the reading of the will. No, this was not happenstance. This was something else entirely. "Tell me everything," she said, setting down her cup, and thus the case began. The countryside leading to Whitcomb Manor was picturesque, the kind of bucolic landscape that adorned the covers of sentimental novels. Rolling green fields, hedgerows bursting with late summer bloom, and quaint cottages nestled against a backdrop of oak and yew. But as the grand house loomed into view, its stately facade imposing against the pale sky, the beauty of the surroundings gave way to something heavier. Agatha Marple took in the sight with quiet appraisal from the back of the hired motor car. She had seen many such houses in her time, houses where wealth sat uneasily upon old bones, where the walls absorbed secrets as readily as they did the scent of polished wood and lavender sachets. Whitcomb Manor was one such house. She stepped from the car with careful precision, adjusting the hat that perched neatly upon her silver curls. The detective was not a striking woman by any conventional measure. Small, quietly dressed in a practical tweed coat, her only adornment a modest brooch shaped like an acorn, but her presence had a way of unsettling those unused to being truly observed. She was greeted at the door by Eleanor Hartley, a lady of modern convictions. Eleanor Hartley was composed, as always, but Agatha Marple noted the slight tension at the corners of her mouth, the careful way she held herself, like a woman accustomed to keeping her emotions in check. She was fashionably dressed in a navy blue day dress with geometric embroidery, her dark auburn hair pinned in a soft bob beneath a cloche hat. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming so promptly," Eleanor said, extending a gloved hand. Agatha took it lightly. "Of course, my dear. I do have something of an interest in vanished men." Eleanor gave a small, tight-lipped smile and led the way inside. The entrance hall of Whitcomb Manor was grand, its polished black and white marble floors gleaming beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. Gilded frames lined the walls, each bearing the face of a Whitcomb ancestor, their expressions ranging from stern to outright disapproving. "You must understand," Eleanor began, leading Agatha through to a more intimate sitting room. "Edmund was not the sort to simply run away." Agatha sank into an armchair, setting her handbag on her lap. "So I gather. Yet here we are." Eleanor hesitated. "Yes." A brief silence settled between them. Agatha studied Eleanor with the mild, pleasant expression she often wore when assessing a person's nature. People liked to talk in silences if you let them. Eleanor did not disappoint. "Edmund had plans," she said, smoothing a crease in her gloves. "He was going to use his inheritance to fund a workers' union. He believed in reform, in change. It was difficult for some to accept." Agatha's brows lifted slightly. "By some, do you mean the Whitcomb family?" Eleanor exhaled, her lips pressing together. "Sir Reginald was furious when he learned of Edmund's intentions. The idea of his fortune being used to dismantle the very industry that made it was, to him, the ultimate betrayal." "Indeed?" Agatha's knitting needles clicked together lightly. "And yet Sir Reginald is dead. The question remains, who benefits from Edmund's disappearance?" Eleanor hesitated again. "Charles, most obviously." Agatha nodded. Charles Whitcomb, the late Sir Reginald's brother, a man who had once been second in line but who now found himself unexpectedly restored to prominence. "And yet," Agatha mused, "one must never overlook the more subtle motives. Greed, of course, is an obvious contender, but revenge, fear, desperation, these can be just as potent." Eleanor watched her carefully. "You think it wasn't just about money?" Agatha gave her a small smile. "Oh, my dear, money is never just about money. A house of secrets." After taking tea, Eleanor led Agatha to Edmund's rooms. They were modest by Whitcomb standards, tucked away at the end of a corridor rather than in one of the grander suites. The door creaked slightly as Eleanor pushed it open. Agatha stepped inside, taking in the space. A bookshelf lined one wall, its contents neatly arranged: philosophy, economics, a few battered novels. The desk was tidy, though a few pages lay scattered across its surface. A half-burned candle sat in a brass holder, and a walking cane leaned against the wall. Agatha approached the bed, where a suitcase had been half-packed, its contents in disarray. "Curious," she murmured. Eleanor frowned. "What is?" "People who leave in a hurry tend to do one of two things. They either take too much or too little. This is neither." She picked up a shirt, neatly folded, and turned it over in her hands, as though he meant to leave but was interrupted. Eleanor swallowed. "You think he was taken?" "Or convinced." Agatha moved to the desk, running a fingertip lightly over a sheaf of notes. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, did Edmund have any confidants, friends outside the family who might have known of his plans?" Eleanor hesitated. "He spoke often with Margaret." Agatha glanced up. "Margaret?" "Yes, Margaret Lane. She was a maid here once. Left years ago but returned recently. She and Edmund became close." "Ah." Agatha's lips pursed thoughtfully. "And she was at the manor the night he disappeared?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "But I do know. She was the last person he spoke to before dinner." Agatha nodded. "It was something to begin with." She glanced once more around the room before stepping to the window. Outside, the great expanse of the Whitcomb estate stretched before her, perfectly manicured hedges, rolling lawns, and beyond them the dark outline of the woods. The air inside the room was still, yet something about it felt wrong. Not merely abandoned, but emptied. Agatha Marple had been in enough houses of grief and deceit to know one thing with certainty. Whitcomb Manor was holding its breath, and sooner or later it would have to exhale. The morning light streamed through the leaded windows of Whitcomb Manor, bathing the great hall in a golden glow that did little to warm the house's inhabitants. The air was thick with the kind of tension that clings to old houses, the weight of unsaid things, of glances exchanged too quickly, of histories carefully rewritten. Agatha Marple sat primly in a high-backed chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. She had no great interest in knitting this morning, but she had long since discovered that people said far more in the presence of a woman who appeared to be occupied with something entirely trivial. And the Whitcomb family was talking. A house fractured. "It's no great mystery, Miss Marple," Charles Whitcomb declared, swirling his morning brandy with a practised ease. "The boy ran away. Always had a taste for theatrics, that one. Thought he could set the world to rights with pamphlets and speeches. Utter nonsense. He was a solid man, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with silvering temples that lent him the air of a statesman, an effect somewhat undermined by the permanent sneer that played about his lips. Your nephew vanishes the night before the will is read, and you find that unremarkable?" Agatha murmured, not looking up from her knitting. Charles let out a bark of laughter. "On the contrary, Miss Marple, I find it entirely predictable. Edmund always believed he was cleverer than he was. It wouldn't surprise me in the least if he's off somewhere staging his own grand return, making us all wait on his convenience." Agatha gave a non-committal hum. "And you, Mr. Whitcomb, are unconcerned by this delay?" Charles set his glass down with a sharp clink. "Not at all. The will shall be read in due course. If Edmund has removed himself from the matter, well—" He spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. "The law is clear in such cases." The law, Agatha knew, was not quite so clear, but Charles was banking on the likelihood that, with Edmund absent, the estate would default to the next logical heir, himself. She observed the way his fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, the slight tightness at the corners of his mouth. No, Charles Whitcomb was not so indifferent as he wished to appear, and yet she sensed that his dislike of Edmund was real, born not of immediate self-interest, but of something older, something festering. A family rift, perhaps. She filed that thought away. Whispers of a ghost. Later that afternoon, as she wandered through the east wing of the manor, Agatha found herself intercepted by a member of the household staff, Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper. "If I might have a word, Miss Marple," the woman said, glancing quickly over her shoulder. "In confidence." Mrs. Henshaw was a woman of strict principles and excellent posture, the sort who ran in the state with the efficiency of a general leading troops into battle. For her to approach Agatha unbidden suggested that she had something of great importance to say. She led Agatha into a small, seldom-used sitting-room and closed the door behind her. "I hope you'll forgive me, Miss Marple, but there are things in this house that ought to be said." Agatha waited. People always spoke, if you gave them the space to do so. Mrs. Henshaw twisted her hands. It's about Miss Margaret." Agatha tilted her head. "Margaret?" The housekeeper hesitated. "You wouldn't have heard of her, of course. She was never meant to be spoken of." Agatha's fingers tightened slightly on her knitting. "Tell me." Mrs. Henshaw sighed. "Years ago, when Sir Reginald was a younger man, there was a girl in service here, a maid named Anne Lane. She was a quiet thing, hard-working, and she caught Sir Reginald's eye." "Ah," Agatha said softly. "The old story, the one that played out in countless great houses across England, the master and the maid, the promises made in the dark, and the consequences left for the woman to bear alone. She fell pregnant," Mrs. Henshaw continued. "It was all hushed up, of course. She was sent away before she began to show. The child, a girl, was raised by an aunt in a village some miles from here, never acknowledged, never spoken of." Agatha's expression remained neutral. "And where is she now?" Mrs. Henshaw's voice dropped to a whisper. "She came back." Agatha felt a flicker of interest. "Under what name?" "Margaret Lane." A perfectly ordinary name, but it sent a small thrill through Agatha nonetheless. "And why did she return?" Mrs. Henshaw hesitated. "I believe she wanted what was rightfully hers." Blackmail and bloodlines. That evening Agatha sat with Eleanor in the dimly lit study, the fire casting flickering shadows across the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. "You knew about Margaret?" Agatha said quietly. Eleanor's fingers curled around the arm of her chair. "Yes." "For how long?" "Months." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Edmund found out first. He told me he felt responsible for her, in a way. Said she had been wronged. Did she ask him for money?" A pause. "She never said it outright, but yes. I believe she was blackmailing Sir Reginald. And when he died—" She turned to Edmund, Agatha finished. Eleanor nodded. "They argued, that much I know. The night before he disappeared, they spoke in the library. I don't know what was said, but when I saw Edmund afterward, he was troubled." Agatha tapped her fingers lightly against the table. "Did he tell you he was planning to leave?" "No." Eleanor's voice was steady, but Agatha detected the slightest tremor beneath it. "He wouldn't have left without telling me." Agatha studied her closely. "You're certain of that?" Eleanor met her gaze, and for a moment something flickered in her dark eyes. Pain, anger, or perhaps something else entirely. "Yes." The gathering threads. Agatha retired to her room that night, with her mind abuzz. Charles Whitcomb had the most to gain from Edmund's absence. But greed was not the only force at play in this house. There was something older at work here. Margaret Lane had been erased from history, and now she had returned. Seeking what? Recognition? Revenge? And what had passed between her and Edmund in that last conversation? Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rattling the window pane. Somewhere in the manor, a clock struck midnight. Agatha Marple pulled the covers up to her chin and closed her eyes. Whitcomb Manor was a house built on secrets, and secrets, she knew, had a way of refusing to stay buried. A steady drizzle had begun to fall over Whitcomb Manor, blurring the edges of the world beyond its heavy, mullioned windows. Inside, the atmosphere was close. Too many secrets, locked in too many rooms, the weight of them pressing against the grand walls. It was not a house accustomed to uncertainty. And yet uncertainty now reigned. At the breakfast table, Charles Whitcomb was holding forth with the air of a man who had regained his footing. "A forgery, obviously," he declared, setting down his coffee cup with an emphatic clink. "The notion that my brother would leave a single penny to that woman—" He caught himself. "To Miss Lane. Preposterous." Across from him, Eleanor Hartley sat poised, her hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. She had said little since the document had been produced, though Agatha, observing from her usual quiet vantage point, noted the slight tightening of her fingers when Charles spoke. "I dare say," Agatha murmured, stirring her tea, "that whether or not the will is genuine is rather the question, isn't it?" Charles gave a tight smile. "Miss Marple, I appreciate your Diligence, but even you must see this is absurd." Agatha did not reply at once. Instead, she let her gaze drift to the butler, Harrison, who was carefully laying out the Morning Post. A competent man with the bearing of one who had served the Whitcombs for many years, and yet, just for an instant, his hands had hesitated over one of the letters, a faint, nearly imperceptible pause. Interesting. She turned back to Charles. "The will, then. Where was it found?" "In my late brother's study," Charles said, smoothing his waistcoat, "among a pile of papers that, I assure you, were entirely disorganized." His mouth twisted slightly at this, as if the very idea of disorder offended him. "I found it myself," Agatha nodded thoughtfully. "And you, of course, would know your brother's handwriting well?" Charles hesitated. "Yes, well enough." "And yet you believe this to be false?" "Absolutely." Agatha took a sip of her tea. "Curious, then, that it was found at all." Charles frowned. "What do you mean?" Agatha set her cup down gently. "If one were to forge a document, Mr. Whitcomb, one would generally wish for it to be discovered. If this will had been meant to remain secret, why would it have been left among a stack of papers so carelessly?" Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. Eleanor, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. "You believe it to be real, then?" Agatha tilted her head. "I believe, Miss Hartley, that Sir Reginald was a man capable of change. Whether he intended to act upon that change, that is another matter. A will in two hands. The study at Whitcomb Manor was a relic of another age, all dark oak and heavy leather, the scent of tobacco still clinging to its walls. Agatha sat at the great mahogany desk, the supposed will spread before her. Across from her, Mr. Phelps, the solicitor, adjusted his spectacles. "The problem, Miss Marple, is not the writing, but the signature." Agatha nodded. The text of the will, the body of it, matched Sir Reginald's previous documents almost exactly, the loops of his letters, the slant of his words, but the signature. "Too careful," Phelps murmured, "too deliberate." It was a small difference, but an important one. A man signing his own will generally did so with a certain familiarity, a swift flick of the pen. This signature, by contrast, had been signed with excruciating precision. A forgery, then? Or had Sir Reginald been uncertain, hesitant as he signed away the bulk of his fortune to an illegitimate daughter no one had ever acknowledged? Agatha sat back, steepling her fingers. A forgery, if well done, is meant to be undetectable. And yet this signature, it stands out. Phelps looked at her curiously. "You suggest it was meant to be questioned?" Agatha gave a small smile. "I suggest, Mr. Phelps, that whoever produced this document did not expect it to go unchallenged. Loyalties and lies." Later that evening, as the fire crackled in the drawing-room, Agatha found herself alone with Eleanor. "You once loved Charles, didn't you?" Agatha asked, her voice mild. Eleanor's breath caught, just for a moment. "Why do you say that? You are not a woman easily flustered, Miss Hartley, and yet, when Charles dismisses you, you react as if it wounds you still." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "It was a long time ago, but not forgotten." A pause. Then, softly, "No." Agatha studied her. "And yet you chose Edmund." Eleanor's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "You make it sound as though I were choosing wallpaper, Miss Marple." "Not at all. I believe you chose very carefully." Eleanor glanced away, staring into the fire. "Charles wanted the things men of his class always want. Power, stability, a wife who knew her place. And Edmund?" "Edmund wanted change." Agatha nodded. "And which did you want?" Eleanor looked at her then, her dark eyes unreadable. "Both." Ah, now they were getting somewhere. A thread pulled loose. It was near midnight when Agatha found herself once again in the study, running her fingers along the spines of books, tracing the grain of the desk. Something did not sit right. The will had been planted to be found, that much was clear, but why forge a document only to invite suspicion? She turned back to the desk. Her eyes fell on an old blotter, the pages thick with years of impressions. She held it to the light, and there, just faintly, beneath layers of old ink, she saw it. A different version of the will. One that bore an entirely different name. One that left the estate not to Margaret Lane, but to Edmund Whitcomb. Agatha Marple's lips pursed in quiet satisfaction. Now, at last, they were getting somewhere. The Whitcomb Manor estate, so grand in the light of day, had a different air in the small hours of the morning. Shadows pooled in the corners of the high-ceilinged rooms, the heavy tapestries seemed to whisper with the ghosts of the past, and the great house itself seemed to breathe, restless, waiting. Agatha Marple had always been fond of such atmospheres. They had a way of forcing truths to the surface. At present she was seated in the library, the golden glow of a single lamp casting flickering light across the vast collection of books. Before her a pile of newspaper clippings and documents lay neatly arranged. A lesser detective might have looked at them and seen a clear path. Edmund Whitcomb, a man of modern convictions, rumoured to have ties with radical socialist movements, disappears on the eve of his inheritance, the perfect scandal, the perfect reason for a young man to be abducted, coerced, or worse. But Agatha had never been one for perfect explanations. She picked up a clipping detailing a factory strike in Manchester, one that Edmund had been vocal about supporting. Another article spoke of a fund for workers' welfare, a fund which, Agatha now suspected, was the true reason behind Sir Reginald's wrath. A socialist kidnapping? No. Someone wanted them to believe it was. A well-placed rumour. The village inn, a cosy but slightly disreputable establishment on the outskirts of Whitcomb, had become something of a local hub for gossip and speculation. That afternoon Agatha made a rare excursion beyond the manor's walls, ordering a modest tea while listening to the chatter of the townspeople. "Terrible business," a man was saying at the next table. "Young Edmund mixed up in all that Labour nonsense, bound to get himself in trouble. Reckon they took 'em," another chimed in. "That lot up in London, always saying they'll make an example of the aristocrats who turn traitor." Agatha stirred her tea idly. "Oh, indeed," she murmured, just loud enough to be heard. "Most tragic, really. Though I do wonder, if such dangerous men had taken poor Mr. Whitcomb, why is it that no demands have been made?" There was a silence. "Kidnappers," Agatha said in the mildest of tones. "Generally they do like to announce themselves." More silence. Then an uncertain voice. "Suppose that is strange." "Very," Agatha agreed. "Almost as if someone wanted you all to believe he was taken rather than simply missing." She left the inn shortly thereafter, her tea unfinished, but her suspicions confirmed. The idea of a socialist plot had been deliberately planted, and that meant someone within Whitcomb Manor had a vested interest in misdirection. The unlikely alliance. Margaret Lane did not trust easily. She had returned to Whitcomb under an assumed name, carrying only the weight of a past she had never been allowed to acknowledge. She had expected hostility. She had expected suspicion. She had not expected Agatha Marple. "Forgive me," she said stiffly, arms crossed as they stood in the dim hallway outside the servants' quarters, "but I fail to see why you believe we have common interests." Agatha studied her. Margaret was not a woman driven by greed. That much was clear. Her anger was real, but it was the anger of the unseen, the forgotten, the sort of anger that came from a lifetime of knowing one had been erased. "I believe, Miss Lane," Agatha said evenly, "that you are looking for something more than an inheritance." Margaret's lips tightened. "I only wanted what was mine. Recognition." Agatha corrected gently. "A place at the table. A name." Margaret said nothing. Agatha took a step closer. "And what if I told you Sir Reginald felt the same?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "You expect me to believe that? The man never once acknowledged me, not in 35 years. Agatha reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. A journal, battered and aged. Margaret hesitated. "What is that?" "Your father's," Agatha said simply. For the first time, Margaret's composure wavered. "You're lying." "I rarely do, my dear," Agatha said, pressing the book into Margaret's hands. "Shall we take a look together?" "The secret room." The hidden chamber was behind a panel in the library, one that slid open with the softest of clicks. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and dust, a writing desk, a few shelves, a lamp that had not been lit in years, and diaries. Sir Reginald had not been a man prone to sentiment, but he had, it seemed, been prone to regret. Margaret stood frozen as she turned the fragile pages. "At Anne's writing shell is Mr. Collins heading home," she said. The title, the ink was faded but legible, the words written in a hand that was unmistakably her father's. "I have done a terrible thing. I have built an empire upon my own vanity, and in doing so I have turned away my own flesh and blood, Margaret. I wonder if she knows how much I think of her. But how could she? I have ensured she will never know." Margaret's breath caught. Agatha, reading over her shoulder, murmured, "Well, well." He turned another page. "Edmund has found out. He confronted me. He wants me to acknowledge Margaret. I told him I would consider it, but I fear it is too late. Charles would never allow it. I see now that I have built my legacy on shifting ground." Agatha's lips pursed. "Now that," she murmured, "is most interesting." Margaret was shaking. "He meant to name you," Agatha confirmed. "And Edmund was going to make sure of it." Margaret swayed slightly, gripping the desk for support. Agatha laid a steadying hand on her arm. "Miss Lane, I do believe we are on the same side after all." Margaret exhaled shakily. "And Charles?" Agatha's smile was thin. My dear, I suspect we shall find that Charles has been working very hard to ensure neither you nor Edmund ever receive what you are owed." The house creaked around them as though Whitcomb Manor itself had been holding its breath, and now, at last, it was ready to exhale. The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke over Whitcomb Manor, sending rain lashing against the windows and rattling the grand house's very bones. Inside, the atmosphere was no less tempestuous. The old order was shifting, long-buried truths clawing their way to the surface. And now someone had killed to keep them from being revealed. Margaret Lane was dead. The discovery. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Henshaw, who found her first. The maid's scream had been sharp, shattering the uneasy silence of the evening. Within moments, figures had come rushing, Childs pale but composed, Eleanor with a hand clutched to her throat. Even Harrison, the butler, who rarely showed such urgency. Margaret lay sprawled in the small sitting-room off the east wing, a modest space she had taken as her own, far from the grand suites of the legitimate Whitcombs. The scene was disarmingly peaceful. A teacup tipped onto its saucer, its contents half-drained. A book, one of Sir Reginald's diaries, its pages marked by a ribbon. But the woman who had fought so long for her rightful place in this house would never read another page. Agatha Marple stood beside the body, her keen gaze flicking from one detail to the next. The cup, the slight stain on Margaret's lips, the faint, bitter scent that lingered in the air. Poison. Too neat. Too deliberate. Margaret had not been an accident. She had been silenced. The acquisition. It was Charles who spoke first. "This is what comes of meddling in things best left alone." Eleanor rounded on him. "For God's sake, Charles, a woman has just died." "And that is precisely the point, my dear," Charles interrupted, voice tight with restrained fury. This entire business has been nothing but a slow-motion disaster. First Edmund, now this. We are being dragged into scandal, into ruin." Eleanor took a step toward him, her dark eyes blazing. "And would that truly be so terrible?" A dangerous silence settled between them. Agatha, watching carefully, finally spoke. "Who had access to the tea?" Harrison, standing stiffly near the door, answered, "It was left on the sideboard, Miss Marple. Miss Lane poured it herself, the sugar, the cream, all within reach." "A careless crime, then," Agatha mused, "or a clever one?" A beat of hesitation. Then Charles exhaled sharply, pacing to the fireplace. "Well, there's no use mincing words. It's Edmund, obviously." Eleanor recoiled. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am quite serious. Think, Eleanor, Margaret was the one person who could confirm his inheritance, his rightful place in all of this. Perhaps he thought she was a liability, or perhaps they quarrelled. Either way, the facts are clear. Eleanor opened her mouth, then shut it, and Agatha saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Margaret's death had shaken something loose. Eleanor knew more than she was letting on. A secret unravel. Later, when the household had retreated into tense silence, Agatha found Eleanor alone in the drawing-room, staring into the fire. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," Agatha said mildly, settling into a chair across from her. "Would you have married Edmund if he had lost the estate?" Eleanor's gaze snapped to hers, sharp as a blade. "What an extraordinary question! And yet one worth considering." Eleanor's expression was impossible to read. "I loved him." Agatha inclined her head. "I believe you did." A pause. "And yet you also once loved Charles." A flicker of something passed over Eleanor's face. "That," she said quietly, "was a long time ago." "But never forgotten," Agatha murmured. "He still has power over you, does he not?" Eleanor's hands curled into fists against her lap. "He always does." Ah, so that was it. Loyalty and ambition, a war Eleanor had been waging within herself for years. Agatha softened her tone. "I suspect, Miss Hartley, that you have found yourself caught between two very determined men." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea." "Oh, my dear," Agatha said, taking up her knitting, "I rather think I do." The shadow in the hallway that night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Agatha took a slow walk through the corridors, considering the facts. Margaret was dead. Poisoned quickly and efficiently. The forged will had been meant to distract. But why? Eleanor's affections were tangled in something deeper than love. And then there was Charles, a man too eager to frame his nephew, a man who had spent years ensuring his own place in the family remained secure. The truth was closing in. She turned a corner and froze. A shadow flitted past the hallway just at the edge of her vision, too quick to be a servant, too deliberate to be a wandering guest. Agatha Marple pressed herself against the wall, listening. Footsteps, faint, measured. Someone was moving through the house, under cover of darkness, and she had a very strong suspicion that whoever it was knew exactly why Margaret Lane had died. A heavy mist had settled over Whitcomb Manor, curling through the grounds like ghostly fingers, swallowing the great house in an eerie hush. The storm had passed, but the tension had not. The house had changed overnight, no longer simply the seat of a powerful family, but a labyrinth of treachery, secrets, and now murder. In the grand drawing-room, Agatha Marple stood before the assembled household, her knitting abandoned for the moment. It was time. The pieces had fallen into place. The tangled threads of deceit had finally unravelled to reveal the truth, a truth that had remained buried for decades, feeding on greed, ambition, and fear. And now it would all come to light. A family in ruin. "You knew?" Agatha said quietly, her gaze fixed on Charles Whitcomb, who stood by the fireplace, a tumbler of whisky in his hand. He arched an eyebrow, ever the composed aristocrat. "Knew what, precisely?" "That Sir Reginald had another family," Agatha said, her voice calm, measured. "That in a modest house just beyond the hills he had a wife and 2 children. A secret second life." The silence was absolute. Eleanor Hartley's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair, her breath catchy. Harrison the butler kept his gaze respectfully lowered, though there was a telltale stiffening of his posture. Even the great Charles Whitcomb, a man who had spent his life controlling every variable in his path, had stopped mid-sip. Agatha continued. "It was never about Margaret, was it?" She turned slightly, addressing the room at large. "The supposed forged will, the one naming Margaret as the rightful heir, was nothing more than a calculated distraction. The real threat to Charles Whitcomb was the possibility that the truth about Sir Reginald's other family would come to light." Charles gave a slow, indulgent smile. "Miss Marple, you do love a bit of drama." "Do I?" Agatha's sharp blue eyes held his steadily. Or is it simply that your carefully managed world is collapsing before your very eyes? A flicker of something, anger? Fear? Passed across his face. You see, Mr. Wickham, I imagine it must have been rather devastating when you learned the truth. Agatha continued, her voice unrelenting. Reginald's legitimate heir was not Edmund, nor was it Margaret. She let the words settle. It was a child from his second family. Eleanor let out a quiet gasp. That, Agatha said softly, is why you orchestrated all of this. The will, the murder of Margaret, and, of course, she paused, then delivered the final blow, the disappearance of Edmund. A slow clap sounded from across the room. All eyes turned to Eleanor, who leaned back in her chair, a wry smile on her lips. Very well done, Miss Marple. The willing conspirator. Eleanor Hartley had always been an enigma, a woman of modern convictions, a suffragette, a thinker, a woman who had for years played the perfect part in a world that never quite accepted her. I suspected you knew, Agatha said, watching her carefully. You were not merely a pawn in Charles's game, were you? You were his partner. Eleanor laughed softly, swirling the brandy in her glass. Oh, Miss Marple, you do have a talent for the dramatic. And yet, I suspect that your girls and Charles's were not quite the same, Agatha continued. You had your own ambitions, did you not? You wanted to reshape Whitcomb Manor into something new, a symbol of modernity, a stronghold for progressive ideals. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. Guilty as charged, and why not? The old world is dying, Miss Marple. These grand houses, these bloodlines, they mean nothing anymore. Her voice darkened. I simply meant to ensure that something useful came of it. Useful? Agatha echoed. By aligning yourself with Charles, you hoped to manipulate the outcome. But I wonder, did you ever truly trust him? Eleanor's lips parted slightly, but before she could answer, Charles gave a soft chuckle. I never intended to share power with her, Miss Marple, he said smoothly, his mask of civility slipping just slightly. Eleanor, my dear, you are quite the idealistic fool. Eleanor's head snapped toward him. You see, Agatha continued. Eleanor believed she was shaping the future, but Charles? He was ensuring that Whitcomb Manor remained exactly as it was, under his control, under the rule of the old world. She turned to Eleanor. You were never his equal. You were merely a means to an end. Eleanor's face hardened. You bastard, she whispered. Charles took a slow sip of his whiskey. Do spare me your righteous fury, Eleanor. You wanted Edmund gone just as much as I did. A sharp silence fell over the room, and in that moment Eleanor's expression shifted, from anger to realization. You, her voice faltered, you never meant for me to succeed. Charles smiled. You were useful, my dear, but now, he shrugged. Rather inconvenient. The final blow. Agatha let the moment settle before speaking. And that, Mr. Whitcomb, is your greatest mistake. Charles turned towards her, amused. Oh? You underestimated one very important thing. And what is that? Agatha's voice was quiet, steady. Me. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a letter, its edges worn, its contents damning. It is Edmund's confession. Or, rather, his last letter to Eleanor before he disappeared, she said, holding it up. In it he details everything, his knowledge of Sir Reginald's second family, his intention to expose it, and, most importantly, his suspicion that Charles had already begun moving against him. Charles stilled. Agatha continued, relentless. You see, Mr. Wickham, you are not nearly as clever as you believe yourself to be. The moment you forged that will, the moment you silenced Margaret, you set yourself on a path that could only end one way. A pause. With you, exposed for the murderer you are. The end of the game. The room erupted. Eleanor lunged toward Charles, but Harrison stepped forward, his steady butler's hand holding her back. Charles, his face darkening, made a move as if to leave, but it was too late. The door opened. 2 policemen stood at the threshold. "Charles Whitcomb," one of them said, stepping forward, "you are under arrest for the murder of Margaret Lane and the disappearance of Edmund Whitcomb." For the first time, Charles looked truly stunned. "Shall we?" Agatha murmured, watching as they led him away. Eleanor stood frozen, her lips parted in shock, her entire carefully crafted world shattered. "You played a dangerous game, Miss Hartley," Agatha said softly. Eleanor let out a slow breath. "And I lost." Agatha studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes. Yes, you did." The morning was cool, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. Whitcomb Manor, standing tall against the misty hills, had borne witness to generations of power, scandal, and betrayal. But today, for the first time in years, it would bear witness to something else. Redemption. Edmund Whitcomb stood at the manor gates, gazing up at the house that had been his birthright, and nearly his grave. He had been a man hunted, accused, and exiled. But he had returned, not as a fugitive, nor as a bitter son, but as something else entirely. A man ready to reclaim his name. Beside him, Agatha Marple gave a small, approving nod. "You hesitate," she observed mildly. Edmund let out a slow breath. "You've seen what this house has done to people, Miss Marple." His voice was steady, though there was a quiet wariness in it. "I don't intend to let it do the same to me." Agatha's knitting needles clicked gently in her hands. "Wise. And yet one cannot run from one's history forever." "No," Edmund agreed. His jaw tightened slightly. "One must face it." And so, with measured steps, he walked through the gates and into the house where his past awaited. The weight of a name. The great hall was silent when Edmund entered. Dust motes swirled in the early morning light, and the remnants of the night's storm had left the windows streaked and grey. Charles Whitcomb was gone, taken away by the authorities, his carefully spun web of deceit finally unravelled. Margaret Lane was dead, silenced by those who had feared what she might reveal. And Eleanor Hartley, once poised to shape a new future for Whitcomb Manor, had been left to reckon with her own part in the deception. But not all had been lost. Seated in the drawing-room was Harrison, the butler, his face impassive as he rose at Edmund's entrance. He had served the Whitcomb family for decades, through scandal and triumph alike, and now, for the first time, he inclined his head ever so slightly in acknowledgment. "Mr. Whitcomb," Edmund exhaled. "Harrison." The butler gestured toward the parlour. "They are waiting for you, sir." A reckoning. Inside, Eleanor, Mr. Phelps, the solicitor, and a handful of distant Whitcomb relatives sat in tense anticipation. Eleanor's eyes flickered over Edmund's face, searching for something. Forgiveness? Understanding? She would find neither easily. "Well," she said softly, "you're back." Edmund met her gaze steadily. "I never intended to leave." A bitter smile touched Eleanor's lips. "No, I imagine you didn't." Agatha Marple, standing quietly near the fireplace, cleared her throat. "I believe before anything else there is one final matter to be settled." She turned toward Mr. Phelps, who nodded and placed a thick envelope on the table before him. "The true will of Sir Reginald Whitcomb," he said solemnly. Silence. Eleanor's eyes darkened. "So it was real." "Yes," Phelps confirmed. "And it names Edmund Whitcomb as the sole heir to the estate." Eleanor did not look surprised, only resigned. Slowly Edmund reached for the document. He had spent much of his life railing against the weight of his family name, the obligations it imposed, the corruption it carried. And yet, as he stared at the parchment before him, he understood something he had not before. It was not the name itself that carried corruption, it was what one chose to do with it. He looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "You wanted to change this place," he said quietly, "and use it as a force for progress." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, wary. "Yes," Edmund nodded. "Then you should help me do it." For the first time, true surprise crossed her face. "You mean to stay?" Edmund set the will down on the table. "I mean to make this place something it was never allowed to be." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she smiled. Not the calculating smile she had once worn, but something genuine. Well, she murmured, I suppose we could call that a victory. The ghosts of the past. Later, as the household began to stir with new purpose, Agatha Marple found herself seated in the sunlit garden, her knitting resting on her lap. Edmund joined her, folding himself into the seat opposite. "You never doubted me," he said. Agatha smiled faintly. "Oh, I doubted you plenty, young man. I simply chose to believe that you would prove me wrong." Edmund exhaled a soft chuckle. "You always knew about the second family, didn't you?" Agatha nodded. "I suspected. The signs were there. Your grandfather was many things, but he was not entirely heartless." Edmund's gaze drifted toward the manor. "And now?" "Now," Agatha said, returning to her knitting, "you decide what to do with the truth." A pause. Then Edmund leaned back in his chair, tilting his face toward the warm light of the afternoon sun. He had returned not to reclaim power, but to reclaim his story, and for the first time Whitcomb Manor felt lighter, as if, at long last, the house had finally exhaled. Days later, as Agatha Marple prepared to leave, Harrison approached her in the front hall. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Marple," he said with quiet respect. Agatha gave a wry smile. "Oh, I do try." Edmund and Eleanor stood at the steps, watching as her car was brought around. "You'll come back, won't you?" Edmund asked. Agatha glanced up at the grand house one final time. "I think," she mused, "that Whitcomb Manor has quite enough detectives for the time being." She stepped into the car, the engine rumbling to life, and as she drove away, the house stood tall behind her, not as a relic of the past, but as a place where the past had been reckoned with, where a family had fallen, and where, against all odds, a new legacy had begun. The morning mist had burned away, leaving Whitcomb Manor bathed in soft autumn sunlight. For the first time in many years, the house felt different. Not merely a monument to its past, but something else entirely. A place where change had arrived. Edmund Wickham stood at the threshold of his ancestral home, watching as the tenants and villagers gathered on the lawn before him. Farmhands, factory workers, house staff, all of them once beholden to the Whitcomb name, now waiting to hear what would come next. He had inherited more than just wealth. He had inherited a responsibility, and he would not squander it. The house reclaimed. Inside the great hall, Eleanor Hartley stood near the hearth, arms folded as she regarded Edmund with measured interest. "Well," she murmured, "this is a first. A Whitcomb hosting a meeting with the common folk rather than dictating to them." Edmund shot her a glance. "You disapprove?" Eleanor gave a small smile. "Not at all. I'm merely enjoying the irony." Edmund chuckled softly, though his expression seemed too serious. "You should be standing beside me." Eleanor's gaze flickered, a shadow of the past crossing her features. "No, Edmund, that was never meant to be my role." She gestured to the grand house around them. "This was always yours." He studied her for a moment before nodding. There had been too many betrayals, too many wounds, but somewhere in their shared history there was still understanding. "Thank you," he said simply. Eleanor inclined her head. "Make good on your promises." And with that she walked away, leaving Edmund to face his future alone. The speech. Outside, the crowd murmured, shifting uneasily as a Whitcomb stood before them, not as a lord, not as a master, but as a man seeking to mend what had been broken. Agatha Marple watched from a quiet corner, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. Edmund cleared his throat. "Many of you have spent your lives working for this house, for my family. And many of you have suffered for it." A ripple of agreement moved through the gathering. "My grandfather believed in power above all else, in keeping things as they were, but I do not." A murmur, this time of surprise. Edmund continued, his voice steady. "Change is coming. This estate will no longer be run as an untouchable empire, but as a home that works with those who built it, not against them." Gasps. A few sceptical chuckles. A Whitcomb saying such things. I will set up a workers' trust for the factory hands, the farm labourers, and the staff of this house. Their voices will be heard, their conditions improved, and more than that." His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on a woman standing near the back, her 2 young children clutching her skirts. "My family, all of my family, will be acknowledged." The woman's eyes widened. A few villagers turned, whispering. Agatha watched with interest. A Whitcomb was legitimizing his father's second family, acknowledging his half-siblings. It was a bold move, but perhaps the only one that truly mattered. Agatha's final counsel, later. As the crowd dispersed, Agatha found herself walking with Edmund through the garden. "You handled that well," she remarked. Edmund smirked. "You sound surprised." She glanced up at him. "Not at all. I've always believed you had it in you, though I confess I did wonder if you would take the easier road." Edmund sighed. "For years I resented this house. I resented what it stood for. But now I see," he gestured to the vast estate, "it's not the place that was corrupt. It was the people who controlled it." Agatha nodded approvingly. "Precisely. Redemption, Mr. Whitcomb, is not found in discarding the past, but in learning from it." A pause. Then Edmund smiled. "You know, Miss Marple," he said lightly, "you'd make an excellent politician." She gave a wry chuckle. "Heaven forbid." They stopped at the manor steps, the sunlight casting long shadows across the gravel drive. Edmund turned to her, his expression earnest. "I owe you a great deal." Agatha waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, nonsense. You owe me nothing, except perhaps," she fixed him with a knowing look, "keep your word, young man. Build something worth remembering." Edmund inclined his head. "I will, and for the first time in many years, Whitcomb Manor, so long a house of shadows, stood on the edge of something new. A legacy not of power, but of purpose." And Agatha Marple, satisfied at last, turned and walked away.